In October of 2011, the most valuable corn in the entire state of Ohio wasn't in a 100,000 bushel silo owned by a multinational corporation. It wasn't number 2 Yellow Dent, flash-dried and graded for the global commodities market. It was in 24 hand-stitched canvas bags, sitting on the worn wooden bed of a 1987 Ford Ranger, with 214,382 miles in the odometer and a persistent driver's side door sag. And the man who owned it, Silas Mercer, had just turned down an offer of $112,000 for it. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look surprised. He just shook his head once and said a quiet no. The man who made the offer, David Sterling, who owned the largest grain mill in 3 counties, just stood there in the gravel driveway, his polished dress shoes collecting a fine layer of limestone dust, unable to process the refusal. The number was supposed to be the end of the conversation. Instead, it was just the beginning of the story. To understand why a 72-year-old man would refuse a 6-figure check for a few £1,000s of corn, you have to go back, not just to the spring of that year, but back 164 years, to the day the Mercer family first put a plow to that same 118 acres of land in the rolling hills of Knox County. Let me tell you about the land. It wasn't prime Ohio farmland, not the flat, black earth country to the west where you could drive for an hour and not see a single contour line. This was hill country, glaciated and stubborn, a mix of clay loam and shale that would break your heart if you tried to force it into being something it wasn't. The Mercers had never tried to force it. They had learned over 5 generations to listen to it. The farm wasn't a factory floor, it was a partner in a long and sometimes difficult conversation. Silas Mercer was 72 years old, had farmed this specific piece of land for 58 of those years, and was known for 2 things: his unhurried, deliberate way of walking, and his refusal to ever borrow money from a bank. He had inherited the farm from his father, who had inherited it from his, in the chain of succession that was as predictable as the turning of the seasons. Silas's hands were maps of that history, thick, calloused, with lines of soil etched so deeply they would never wash clean. He stood 5 feet 10 inches, same as his great-grandfather, and had the same quiet blue eyes that seemed to be looking at something a little farther off than everyone else. In 1968, when his neighbors were all tearing out fence rows to accommodate the massive new John Deere combines and signing contracts for hybrid seed that promised yields of 150 bushels an acre, Silas had kept his father's fields small. He kept the windbreaks of Osage orange his grandfather had planted. And most importantly, he kept his father's seed corn. Let me tell you about the seed. It wasn't a registered variety. It had no commercial name. The Mercers just called it the family corn. It was an open-pollinated dent corn, a genetic library of 150 years of adaptation to that specific 118 acres. Its ancestors had survived the drought of 1895, the floods of 1913, and the blight of 1970. Every year, for a century and a half, the best ears from the strongest plants, the ones that stood firmest against the wind, that held their moisture in the dry spells, that resisted the pests, were selected by hand and saved for the next planting. The result was not uniformity. It was a riot of color and form. In a single scoop of kernels you would see deep reds, purples so dark they were almost black, sunny yellows, and creamy whites, some speckled, some striped. It was a visual record of resilience. To an agronomist, it was a genetic mess. To a commodity trader, it was worthless. To Silas Mercer, it was the most valuable thing he owned. He stored it not in a climate-controlled vault, but in 24 canvas bags his grandmother had sewn from old sailcloth in 1922. The stitching was uneven but strong, each bag closed with a simple leather drawstring. These bags were the family's savings account, its insurance policy, and its covenant with the future. In the spring of 2011, Silas planted 15 acres of his family corn, just as he always did. He used his father's 1952 Alice Chalmers Model G tractor, a small, nimble machine that looked like a toy next to the 400 horsepower monsters his neighbours drove. He planted his rows 38 inches apart, the old way, not the 30-inch standard of modern agriculture. He used no commercial fertilizer, only the manure from his small herd of 7 dairy cows and the nitrogen fixed by the clover he planted as a cover crop. His neighbours, running their GPS-guided planters, watched him and shook their heads. They were good men, but they were men caught in a system of high inputs and high yields, of massive bank loans and razor-thin margins. They saw Silas not as a farmer, but as a relic, a living museum piece. They didn't understand that Silas wasn't farming for this year's balance sheet. He was farming for his grandson. He was only 10 years old, but already had the family's quiet eyes. Silas was practicing a form of agriculture that measured its success not in bushels per acre, but in generations per farm. And that kind of accounting wasn't taught in business school. It couldn't be quantified on a spreadsheet. It had to be lived. It had to be inherited. It had to be stored in old canvas bags and planted with a belief that the land knew better than the laboratory. The man who ran the numbers, the man who believed in the laboratory, was David Sterling. Sterling was 42 years old, had an MBA from Ohio State University, and had, for the past decade, been the CEO of Sterling Grains, a company his grandfather had founded as a simple feed mill in 1948. David had transformed it. He'd invested $4.7 million in 2005 to build a state-of-the-art grain elevator and milling facility just off the state highway. It was a monument to modern efficiency. Gleaming stainless steel silos held a combined 1.2 million bushels of corn. Optical scanners sorted kernels by colour and size. A computer-controlled system could load a semi-trailer in under 11 minutes. David Sterling was not a farmer. He was a manager of agricultural commodities. He wore pressed shirts to work and believed, with an almost religious fervour, in the power of data. He could tell you the precise moisture content, test weight, and protein level of every bushel in his facility. He spoke the language of futures markets, basis points, and logistical optimization. He was a good man, a pillar of the community, and he was absolutely certain that the future of farming lay in uniformity, scale, and technology. He saw men like Silas Mercer as a drag on progress, a romantic but ultimately unsustainable nod to a past that was best left behind. He believed in helping farmers, but his definition of help was showing them how to increase their yields by adopting the latest hybrid seeds and chemical inputs, thereby providing his mill with a more consistent, more predictable, and more profitable product. Let me tell you about Sterling Grains. It was an impressive operation. The main office was a glass and steel building that looked more like a regional bank than a grain mill. Inside, a bank of monitors displayed real-time commodity prices from the Chicago Board of Trade. David's desk was a massive slab of polished oak, and on it sat a small acrylic cube containing a single, perfect kernel of number 2 Yellow Dent corn. That kernel was his icon. It was the platonic ideal of corn, genetically uniform, optimized for yield, perfectly suited for industrial processing. It was the opposite of the chaotic diversity in Silas Mercer's canvas bags. To David, that single, perfect kernel represented order, predictability, and profit. Silas's corn represented chaos, nostalgia, and inefficiency. The two worldviews were destined to collide, and they did so on a Tuesday morning in late September of that year. Silas had harvested his 15 acres. His total yield was 1,800 bushels, a respectable but unremarkable 120 bushels per acre. His neighbours, in what was shaping up to be a good year, were pulling in over 180. Silas didn't sell his corn on the open market. For years he'd had a small but loyal customer base for his stone-ground cornmeal, a few local families, a bakery in the next town over, and a man who swore it was the only thing that made his grandmother's cornbread recipe taste right. His old stone burr mill, a small belt-driven affair in his barn, had finally given up the ghost the previous winter, a main bearing seizing up after 80 years of service. He needed to get about 50 bushels ground into meal. The only real option was sterling grains. So Silas loaded 10 of the canvas bags into the back of his old Ford Ranger and made the 7-mile drive. He pulled up to the massive receiving bay, a space designed for 18-wheelers, and his small truck looked like a child's toy. A yard worker, a young man of maybe 20, looked at the canvas bags with a confused expression. "Here to sell?" he asked. "No," Silas said quietly. "Here to mill." The young man called for his boss. David Sterling himself came out, more out of curiosity than anything else. He saw Silas, whom he knew by sight, and the ancient-looking bags. He was polite, professional. "Silas, what can we do for you?" Silas explained his situation. He needed about 3,000 pounds of corn ground into a medium-coarse meal. David nodded. "All right, let's get a sample and check the specs. We can run it through the hammer mill this afternoon. Standard fee is 12 cents a pound." He reached into one of the bags and pulled out a handful of kernels, and then he stopped. He looked at the corn in his palm, the reds, the blues, the yellows, the sheer, shocking lack of uniformity. He rolled the kernels between his fingers. They were smaller, denser than the hybrids he was used to. He looked from the corn in his hand back to Silas's weathered face, and then he laughed. It wasn't a mean laugh. It was a laugh of genuine, uncomprehending amusement, the laugh of a physicist being presented with a perpetual motion machine. "Silas," he said, still smiling, "what on earth is this?" "It's my corn," Silas replied, his voice even. "I can see that. But what is it? I can't grade this. It's all over the place. Look at it." He held his hand out. "There are 3 different colours in this pinch alone. The moisture content will be inconsistent. The test weight will be a nightmare for the mill. This is a museum piece, Silas. It's not a crop." Silas didn't flinch. He just looked at the massive steel silos gleaming in the morning sun. "It's what this land wants to grow," he said. The statement hung in the air. It was so simple, so devoid of data or economic reasoning, that David Sterling didn't know how to respond to it. It was a statement from another century. He shook his head, the smile fading into a look of pity. "Look, I can't run this through my system. The sorters will go haywire. It'll contaminate the run of number 2 dent we're doing for ADM. It's just not compatible." He brushed the kernels from his hand. "Tell you what, I've got a few bags of Pioneer P1151 AM seed in the warehouse. Top of the line, triple stacked trait. I'll give it to you. No charge. Plant that next spring. You'll get 200 bushels an acre, easy. We'll buy it all back from you at a premium." That's how you make money in farming today, Silas. Not with this heirloom stuff. The offer was generous. It was practical. It was, by any modern agricultural standard, the right advice. For a moment, the yard fell silent. The hum of the giant fans in the drying bins was the only sound. Silas looked at David Sterling, a man half his age who was trying to help him, who was trying to save him from himself. He saw the genuine conviction in the younger man's eyes. He nodded slowly. "I appreciate the offer, David," he said. His voice was quiet, but carried a weight that the noise of the mill couldn't drown out. "But I'll be keeping my own seed." He walked to the back of his truck, closed the tailgate, and without another word got into the cab. He turned the old Ranger around and drove away, the 24 canvas bags holding his worthless, unmillable museum-piece corn sitting in the back. As he drove down the long paved driveway, he could see David Sterling in his rearview mirror, just standing there, shaking his head. Silas Mercer did not go home defeated. He went home with a problem. And problems on the Mercer farm were not seen as crises, but as puzzles to be solved with what you had on hand. What he had on hand was an old forgotten building at the bottom of the hill by the creek, the old grist mill. It hadn't been used since 1953, the year his father bought their first tractor with a PTO shaft and a small portable hammer mill to grind feed. The water wheel was rotted, the leather belts had long since turned to dust, and the roof had a hole the size of a small calf. But the bones were good. The foundation was hand-laid stone set in place in 1888, and inside, under a half-century of dust and raccoon nests, were the millstones. Let me tell you about the stones. They were French bourre stones, quarried near La Ferté-sous-Jouarre in the Paris basin. They were not single pieces of rock, but sections of freshwater quartz chosen for its hardness and porosity, cut and fitted together with the precision of a watchmaker, and bound with an iron band. His great-grandfather had paid $600 for them in 1887, a fortune at the time, and had them shipped by steamliner to Baltimore, then by rail to Ohio, and then by horse-drawn cart the final 20 miles. These stones were the pinnacle of milling technology in their day. The unique porous nature of the quartz allowed them to be dressed to a razor's edge but remain cool, preserving the delicate oils and nutrients in the grain. Modern hammer mills and roller mills were faster, more efficient, but they generated heat that destroyed flavor. They pulverized grain into a uniform dead powder. These stones, Silas knew, would shear it, leaving its character and life intact. For the next 4 months, Silas worked on the old mill. He was 72 years old, but he moved with the steady, efficient pace of a man who has done physical labor his entire life. He started with the roof, replacing the rotten timbers with oak cut from his own woodlot. He cleared the sluice that fed water from the creek, digging out decades of silt and fallen leaves with a shovel. The community of neighbors, the same ones who shook their heads at his farming methods, came to help. One was a welder and repaired the iron fittings for the water wheel. Another was a carpenter and helped him fashion new paddles from white oak. They thought he was crazy, a man spending his autumn on a folly, but they helped anyway, because that's what neighbors did. The hardest part was the stones. The runner stone, the top one that spins, weighed nearly 1,500 pounds. He had to hoist it with a chain fall, clean the accumulated grime from its surface, and then dress it. Dressing a millstone is a lost art. It involves recutting the furrows, the intricate pattern of grooves that channels the grain from the center to the edge and allows the flour to escape. The tools are specialized: a mill bill, which is a type of steel chisel, and a thrift, the handle that holds it. It is precise, demanding work. One wrong tap can ruin the balance of the stone. Silas had watched his grandfather do it once, as a small boy. He remembered the rhythmic tap, 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 the smell of stone dust, the intense concentration on his grandfather's face. He had the old tools, rusted but sound, in a wooden chest. For 2 weeks, he sat on a small stool in the dim light of the mill, and with a patience that bordered on prayer, he brought the cutting edge back to those stones. By late November, it was done. The new water wheel turned, the massive hickory gears engaged, and the runner stone began to spin over the bedstone with a low, hungry rumble. The sound hadn't been heard in that valley in 58 years. He poured a scoop of his multicolored corn into the hopper, a fine, golden, fragrant meal, flecked with red and blue from the bran, began to pour from the chute. It smelled of nuts and toast and rich earth. It smelled alive. Silas had his cornmeal. He had solved his problem with the materials at hand. He had no idea that the world was about to change in a way that would make his solution not just a matter of personal pride, but of economic survival. Let me tell you about the drought of 2012. It didn't arrive like a thunderclap, it crept in. The spring of 2011 had been wet, lulling everyone into a false sense of security. But the summer was dry. The autumn was drier. The winter of 2011 to 2012 saw only 4.3 inches of snow, less than a third of the average. The ground went into the spring of 2012 with a deep moisture deficit. Farmers were worried, but they were always worried about something. They planted their crops, the same high-yield hybrids they always did. They put their faith in the predictions, in the technology, in the sheer productive power of American agriculture. The rain, they believed, would come. It did not. May was dry. June was a furnace. For 28 consecutive days in July, the temperature in Knox County topped 95 degrees Fahrenheit. The corn, the modern hybrid corn that covered millions of acres in a vast, genetically identical carpet, began to suffer. This corn was an incredible athlete, bred to perform under ideal conditions. With precise amounts of water and nitrogen, it would produce staggering yields. But it was a specialist. It had no resilience, no deep genetic memory of hardship. Its root systems were notoriously shallow. It was designed to be fed and watered, not to forage for itself. By mid-July, the fields were a catastrophe. The plants, which should have been tasseling, were stunted, their leaves rolling up into tight, thirsty spikes to conserve moisture. They were firing from the bottom up, the lower leaves turning a sickly, papery brown. The air, which should have been thick with the sweet smell of pollen, was dusty and still. David Sterling watched the disaster unfold from his air-conditioned office. His monitors, which usually showed him a rising tide of profit, now showed him a crisis. The price of corn on the futures market was skyrocketing, but that was no comfort if he had no corn to sell. His business depended on volume. He had forward sold 800,000 bushels to buyers, promising delivery in October. Now his suppliers, the farmers he had advised, whose operations he had financed, were calling him, their voices strained with panic. Their yields weren't just down, they were decimated. Fields that were supposed to produce 180 bushels an acre were yielding 50, if they were lucky. Some were yielding 0, a total loss. The great, efficient, uniform system was collapsing under the stress. Uniformity, it turned out, was another word for shared vulnerability. A single weakness, a single stressor, could wipe everything out. The machine was breaking. 7 miles away, Silas Mercer walked his 15 acres of corn. His field did not look like the fields of his neighbours. It was not a uniform stand of dying soldiers. It was messy. It was diverse. Some plants were struggling, their leaves curled just like the hybrids, but others were not. Some, the ones with the genetic memory of a drier past, had sent roots deep into the clay subsoil, finding moisture far below the surface. Some plants were tall, others shorter. The colours of the stalks ranged from green to a deep, streaking red. It wasn't a perfect field, but it was a living one. The genetic diversity that David Sterling had laughed at was now its saving grace. When one set of genes struggled with the heat, another set thrived. It was an ecosystem, not a factory assembly line. Pollen was in the air. The ears, though smaller than they would be in a good year, were filling out. Silas knew his yield would be down. Maybe 90 bushels an acre, he figured. A 25% reduction. His neighbours were facing an 80% to 100% loss. He wasn't a genius.
It wasn't a profit. He had simply trusted in a system that had been tested by 150 years of droughts, floods, and blights. He had trusted his inheritance. That fall, when the combines finally rolled through the withered fields of Knox County, the scale of the disaster became official. The average corn yield was 42 bushels per acre. Sterling Grains was facing a catastrophic shortage. The price for what little corn was available was astronomical, and David Sterling, who had contracts to fill, was getting desperate. Word travels slowly in the country, but it travels surely. It moves not through media, but through conversations at the feed store, over cups of coffee at the diner, across fence lines. The story of Silas Mercer's corn began to circulate.
At first, it was just curiosity. People drove by his field, saw the stand of healthy, if not perfect, corn, and wondered. Then, in early October, the story took on a new dimension. A chef from Columbus, a man named Michael Santoro, who ran a celebrated farm-to-table restaurant called the Gilded Plow, was on a sourcing trip, desperately looking for local produce that had survived the drought. He heard a rumor about an old farmer in Knox County with some unusual corn. He followed a series of rambling back roads and found his way to the Mercer farm. He found Silas not in the field, but in the old grist mill, a small cloud of fragrant dust hanging in the afternoon light. Silas was bagging his first run of cornmeal from the newly harvested crop. The smell hit Santoro first. It was unlike any cornmeal he had ever smelled. Rich, complex, sweet. Silas, in his quiet way, offered him a handful to inspect. Santoro saw the colours, the flecks of red and purple bran. He asked if he could taste it.
Silas took a pinch, put it in a dry cast-iron skillet over a small flame, and toasted it for a moment. He handed the skillet to the chef. Santoro tasted it. His eyes, the eyes of a man who made his living from his palate, widened. The flavour was a revelation. It wasn't the one-dimensional sweetness of modern corn. It was nutty, earthy, profoundly complex. It tasted of the soil it came from. "What do you call this?" Santoro asked, his voice full of reverence. "It's just corn," Silas said. Santoro asked if it was for sale. Silas said it was. He was planning on selling it for $5 for a 2-pound bag, his usual price. Santoro did some quick math in his head. He used 50 pounds of polenta a week at his restaurant. The commodity stuff he was buying was flavourless filler. This was a centerpiece ingredient. "I will give you $10 a pound for it," Santoro said, "and I will buy every pound you are willing to sell me." Silas did the math. That was $20 for a 2-pound bag, 4 times his price. He looked at the chef, a young man with an earnest face and a passion Silas could recognize. He agreed to sell him £200 to start. Santoro wrote him a check for $2,000 on the spot. Before he left, he asked, "What are you going to do with the rest of it?" Silas shrugged. "Probably feed it to the cows." Santoro looked at him horrified. "You can't do that," he said. "This isn't animal feed. This is gold." The chef went back to Columbus and put Silas Mercer's 1847 legacy polenta on his menu for $28 a plate. It sold out every night. He called Silas and begged for more. Other chefs heard about it. The story started to grow. The community witnesses, the neighbours, saw the fancy cars with city license plates driving down Silas's lane. They saw the bags of cornmeal being loaded. They saw the relic becoming a sensation. And they saw something else. They saw a quiet, stubborn old man being vindicated. By the last week of October, David Sterling was in a bind, a very expensive bind. He was short 300,000 bushels on his contracts. Buying on the open market at the inflated drought prices would cost him over $2.4 million, a sum that would bankrupt his company. He was exploring every option, calling suppliers from 3 states away. No one had corn to sell. Then his plant manager mentioned the rumor he'd heard at the diner, the one about the old Mercer fellow and the chefs from the city paying insane prices for his cornmeal. David dismissed it at first. A few bags of specialty cornmeal wouldn't solve his problem. But the rumor persisted. They said Silas hadn't just had a crop survive, they said it had thrived. They said he had nearly 1,500 bushels of this strange, multicolored corn stored in his barn. Desperation is a powerful motivator. It makes you reconsider things you have dismissed. It makes you drive down gravel roads you never thought you'd travel.
On October 28th, a cloudless autumn day, David Sterling drove his gleaming new GMC Sierra Denali down Silas Mercer's long, unpaved lane. He parked behind the 1987 Ford Ranger, the contrast between the two vehicles a perfect metaphor for the two men. He found Silas in the barn, not the mill, methodically sorting the best ears from the harvest for next year's seed. He was placing them carefully into the old canvas bags. There were hundreds of bushels of the shelled corn in wooden bins nearby. David could smell it, the same rich, earthy aroma the chef had noticed. It smelled like money he desperately needed. David didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Silas," he began, "I was wrong." It was a hard admission for a man like him, but he said it. "I've seen what the drought did. I've seen your field. I hear you have a good harvest." Silas didn't stop his work.
He selected another ear, a beautiful specimen with kernels of deep maroon, and ran his thumb over them. "It was an adequate year," he said. "I need to buy it," David said, his voice tight. "All of it. I'll pay you a premium. The market price is $8.10 a bushel. I'll give you $12. It was an extraordinary offer. It would have netted Silas over $21,000. Silas kept sorting. "It's not for sale by the bushel," he said. "I'm having it milled." David's frustration was palpable. He was a man used to getting his way, to solving problems with money. "Okay, fine. The cornmeal. You're selling it for what? $5 a bag? $10 to that chef? That's retail. I'm talking wholesale. I'll buy everything you have left, the whole harvest, right now. One check." David had done the calculations in his truck on the way over. He figured Silas had maybe 80,000 pounds of corn left. He knew he had to make an offer so large, so overwhelmingly powerful, that it couldn't be refused. He had to speak the only language he was sure the old farmer would understand, the language of a life-changing number. He pointed to the 24 canvas bags Silas was now filling with the precious seed corn he'd just selected. "You have, what, a few £1,000 left after what you've sold? Let's call it £4,000. I'll buy it, not as corn, as a specialty product. I'll give you $28 a pound for it." David took a deep breath. He was about to make the biggest gamble of his career. $112,000 for what's in those bags and bins. One check today. This was the moment from the beginning of the story. The number hung in the dusty air of the barn, shimmering with the weight of its zeros. It was more money than Silas Mercer had likely seen in his entire life. It was enough to buy a new tractor, a new truck, to fix every building on the farm, to secure his retirement and his grandson's future. It was the logical, sensible, overwhelmingly correct answer to every problem he might have. David Sterling stood there, confident, his checkbook in his breast pocket. He had just solved the problem. Silas finally stopped his work. He placed the ear of corn he was holding into one of the canvas bags. He cinched the leather drawstring tight. He turned and looked at David Sterling, not with anger, but with a kind of weary sadness. You told me this wasn't a crop, Silas said, his voice barely a whisper. You were right. It's my family's legacy. He patted one of the canvas bags. This here is next year's seed, and the year after that, and the year after my grandson takes over this farm. That's not for sale at your price. He looked at the bins of shelled corn destined for the mill. And that, he said, gesturing to the rest of the harvest, belongs to my customers, the people who appreciate it. He then delivered the final, unanswerable line. It was not a reframing of logic. It was a rejection of its premise. Your number is too small, David. You're trying to buy a harvest. What I have here is a history, and the price for that is a little higher. He did not sell. The aftermath played out slowly, without drama. David Sterling did not go bankrupt. He took a massive financial hit, was forced to sell off a portion of his company to a larger conglomerate, and lost a significant measure of his certainty. 3 years later, in a move that surprised everyone, Sterling Grains opened a small artisanal milling division. They called it the Heritage Line. David Sterling had learned a lesson that wasn't taught in business school. He learned that resilience is not the same as efficiency. Silas Mercer became a quiet legend. He never sold his corn in bulk. He continued to sell it in 2-pound bags to a growing list of chefs, bakers, and families who drove out to the farm and paid his price without question. His income that year, from the slow, steady sales, was $78,400. It was less than the single check David Sterling had offered, but it was earned on his own terms. It was sustainable. It repaired the barn roof, bought a new bearing for the mill, and started a college fund for his grandson. His son, the young inheritor, who had been working a job in the city and had always been skeptical of his father's old-fashioned ways, came home the following spring to help with the planting. He saw the line of cars coming for the cornmeal. He saw the respect in the eyes of the people who bought it. He saw that his father hadn't been clinging to the past. He had been cultivating a future. He stayed. He learned how to dress the stones. What survives is not always the strongest or the most efficient. Sometimes what survives is what has the deepest roots, the most diversity, the most memory. The Mercer farm survived, not because it optimized for the best years, but because it was built to endure the worst. In the quiet logic of the land, a handful of multicolored corn, stored in a canvas bag sown by a grandmother a century ago, is worth more than 1,000 acres of perfect, uniform, and fragile abundance. It wasn't a museum piece. It was a blueprint for survival.